My name is Leshi Chandrapala and I'm a spokesperson for COVID bereaved Families for Justice.
Sean Elliott, Senior Policy Officer at the TUC.
Why do we need this inquiry?
This inquiry is about delivering accountability and justice to the thousands of people that died during the COVID pandemic, many of whom we think died as a result of contracting the virus during their working day. But it's also about getting answers and about learning lessons from this once-in-a-generation pandemic so that we can make sure in future we're prepared and we're protected against any future crises like this. Families and those who've lost loved ones want to see answers. They want government coming forward with the truth.
My dad was a bus driver in London. He contracted COVID and died in May 2020. He was 64 and very fit and had an incredibly good, healthy lifestyle and was looking forward to retirement later on that year. He was, out there on the front line, and then he'd just come back home. Yeah, he wasn't doing anything else other than working. He was just the love of my life, really.
How do you think people who have been bereaved, how do you think they feel when it's being used as a political football?
I think it's devastating. If you've lost loved ones throughout the COVID pandemic and you've learned latterly that while many of us weren't able to go to funerals, weren't able to see loved ones, ministers and their aides were partying in government, I think it's really difficult for families who've lost loved ones to be able to stomach now seeing the government using the inquiry as a political football. We won't stand for it. And I think that's been very clear from Baroness Hallett and all of those involved in the inquiry that they mean business, that this is a serious inquiry and they're going to get to the truth.
Who would you say was most at risk during the pandemic?
We know that there were a whole range of different groups that were at risk during the pandemic, but we know that thousands of working age people lost their lives because they were sent out to workplaces and they weren't kept safe.
What did it look like if you were a bus driver working in, say, March, April, May of 2020?
He was coming into contact with a large amount of the population, and they were, there was high levels of COVID at that point. He didn't have any PPE. They gave bus drivers gloves, but no masks, and there were no safety measures put into place that I know of at the time of his contracting COVID. We bought him a mask, but it was not the right type of mask. It was not fit for purpose. He was very scared, and I remember him. He had washed his hands so much that they were sore and they were bleeding.
You didn't have the social distancing that would needed to be in place in order to keep you safe. You didn't have the adequate shields in order to keep you safe. People were still getting on public transport and able to come in very close proximity to bus drivers and others working on our transport network. And that played out in social care too, where care workers who need to come extremely close to the people that they're caring for to do the day-to-day essentials that they need to do, washing and caring for those people that they provide care for. They didn't have the adequate facial masks that they needed, the adequate PPE to cover their body and make sure that they weren't at risk of contamination, and crucially at risk of taking it back out into other workplaces. Many carers care for more than one individual, going between different homes, but also they're going back out into their own homes and into our communities. And so this wasn't just about their own safety, this was a huge public health safety. But what we know is that social care, that transport networks were neglected, that employers didn't get with the programme quick enough, but also that our health and safety executive had suffered 10 years of devastating funding cuts that meant it wasn't able to do its job effectively and make sure that there were proper guidelines in place and that crucially employers were following those guidelines and keeping their workers safe. I spoke to social care workers that were really scared and that were organising between themselves to buy the PPE that they felt they needed. We know that thousands of key workers were going out to work every day and risking their lives in order to do so, and many felt deeply unsafe. And unfortunately, they were right to feel that way. They weren't being kept safe. Government and employers failed key workers up and down the country.
Boris Johnson asked my dad to keep the city moving, and that's what my dad did with a lot of grace and dignity. I wasn't able to say goodbye to my dad. He was ventilated at Ealing Hospital not being able to be there when he was so sick, and not be able to hold his hand or say goodbye has left me traumatized, to be honest. I need to know, why safety measures weren't put into place soon enough. They would have protected my dad, and also why we didn't lock down soon enough. And that's why the inquiry is important.
There is a huge racial equality angle underpinning all of this. We know that in our communities, Black and ethnic minority households and those living in them were much more likely to contract the virus and to die as a result. But when you look at two of those key occupation groups that we've mentioned, social care and those bus drivers, BME communities are overrepresented in that workforce, and they were much more likely to die as a result. Why is it that those groups in particular, that those workplaces were neglected and they weren't protected in the way that we protected some other workforces? And it's about who the government of the day act in the best interest of. And as we've seen, and as this inquiry will show, we've had 13 years of a Conservative government that has acted in the interests of the wealthy and not of working people. For 10 years, our public services were decimated by deep, deep spending cuts. Public sector workers had 10 years of their pay being repeatedly cut, and that created a public sector workforce crisis. That meant we went into the pandemic with dangerously low staffing levels in our NHS, in social care and elsewhere, and those are the services that working class families need and rely on. We know too that the government made deep cuts and devastating changes to the safety net, the social security system, that would have protected many of those families.
Do you think the same would happen again if we were to have another pandemic?
I think if we don't take this inquiry seriously, we could see a repeat of many of those issues. And actually what we've heard from the government in the years following the pandemic is more talk of spending cuts. So it's the same playbook as we heard in austerity. They may not be using the word austerity, but what they've bedded in through successive budgets, particularly the autumn 2021 comprehensive spending review, last year and this year's March 2023 budget, are more spending cuts that continue to ravage our public services and destroy that fabric that holds our society together.
250,000 people died, including my father, and that is a monumental event in our recent history. We need to learn lessons so that this doesn't happen to other people. We need to learn how to deal with and how to keep people safe, especially if they're on the front line.
What we need is accountability. We need to know who made decisions, why did they make them, in whose interest did they make them. We need justice. Where were mistakes made? How can we give justice to those families that needlessly lost loved ones during the pandemic? And we need lessons learned. We need to know, how do we make changes? What changes do we need? And that they're going to be made quickly for the benefit of everyone.
I just loved my dad so much. I can't put into words, how much he still means to me. And, everything I do for Dad.